We are now up to the 6th chapter in our story of Herb Ryman, a key Disney artist who worked on many films and later helped design the parks. In this series, we have explored his childhood, his experience at art school, his work at MGM, and his travels overseas, all of which are experiences that will prepare him for his unique role at Disney. And today we are finally up to the chapter where his career begins to merge with the Disney studio. And so if you're ready, here we go. Herb Ryman arrived in New York in the fall of 1937. He explored its museums and galleries. He found other young artists like himself working on painting, and he saw that the city held near nightly lectures on the history of art. Though New York art circles had established social groups, Ryman remained hopeful and still felt a sense of coming change that he would somehow fit in here. During these same weeks, the Disney studio continued to experience its own sense of change. In December, its first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, premiered in Los Angeles, opening to rave reviews. But the following month, the film had its New York premiere at Radio City Music Hall, which was situated in the exact same neighborhood, Midtown West Side, as many of the galleries that interested Ryman. Though Ryman never mentioned seeing Snow White while in New York, it would have been impossible for him to have been unaware of its release, along with the deep impact it had on the film world, as the Radio City engagement brought crowds for weeks that lined up outside. Up until Snow White, American animation in the sound era had largely existed to present either comic scenarios, such as in the Mickey Mouse shorts, which leaned toward the type of physical humor found in silent films such as those featuring Charlie Chaplin, or musical fantasies such as the Silly Symphonies, which leaned toward colorful spectacles in which movement was paired with sound. Snow White transformed animation in large part because Walt Disney embraced the dramatic strategies of contemporary live-action production. Though Snow White presented comic and musical sequences, the animation developed depth by creating dialogue that rounded out the characters with believable complexity, and by using the tools of acting so that drawn figures, through movement and gesture, communicated a wide range of human emotions. In other words, Walt incorporated the traditions of live-action dramatic design, drawing inspiration from films produced at Warner Brothers, Fox, and of course MGM, to transform the identity of his animation studio. Through this, Walt demonstrated that he was interested in exploring new types of narratives beyond comedy and musical fantasies that animation, with a higher level of artistry, might communicate. The film was also an early color feature during a time when the vast majority of Hollywood features were still released in black and white. The Daily News reported that the initial New York audience for Snow White was largely adults, and as the film played, they sat in their seats spellbound. While the Disney film enjoyed a grand reception at the music hall, a few blocks away, Ryman met with gallery owners to arrange a showing of the work he had developed overseas. Robert Macbeth of the Macbeth Gallery, one of the first galleries to specialize in American artists, agreed to host the show for Ryman in February. The show would feature Ryman's impressions of China and Japan, countries that, in a period before commercial jets, were too far away for the average American to visit. But as the gallery specialized in American artists and American subjects, its owners encouraged Herbie to include drawings that showcased American life and landscapes as well, including those recently done in Maine. Ryman assembled about 35 highly detailed line drawings. Officially, his exhibition was described by the gallery as drawings, though in addition, his show likely included watercolors, as the gallery also specialized in this medium. His show opened on Wednesday, February 23, 1938. Ryman would later point out that the work of another artist, later to become a leading American painter, was also in the gallery that week. Andrew Wyeth was in the back room and I was in the front room, Ryman said, suggesting that the owner valued the work of Ryman above that of Wyeth. But this was likely because the work of Wyeth was either left over from an exhibition of 23 watercolors that he had arranged the previous fall, or the gallery might have simply been presenting more of Wyeth's paintings, as those from his initial show had sold so quickly that the gallery's owner, Robert Macbeth, had taken Wyeth on as a client. But Ryman's statement, in which he later compared himself so favorably to Wyeth, illustrates how deeply he wanted to be part of this world, the American art scene. Though Wyeth would later be known for his efforts with tempera, in 1937 and 1938 he worked primarily with watercolors much like Ryman. Wyeth's work presented familiar rural settings, the farm, a stream, a man repairing a roof. But he imbued them with a deep sense of brooding, touching on the sadness and struggle that permeated daily life. His work also held notes of abstraction, visually transforming the landscape through Wyeth's emotional connections to these places. Ryman's work, in contrast, transported the viewer to distant cultures with a far stronger sense of realism and a desire to convey the culture of Asia. Though both painters focused on the world around them, the locus of Wyeth's vision came from within, whereas the locus of Ryman's vision came from an effort to convey with honesty the world he saw, shaping his drawings and watercolors as an artist, but rarely overlaying his own emotions and interior life on the subjects he chose to paint. To put this another way, Ryman's style was more closely attached to the recent history of American painting, whereas Wyeth's was better aligned with how painting would expand in the years ahead. As always, Ryman made an effort to communicate his success to his mother in Decatur, where the local paper ran a short article about his experience in New York. By the end of March, Ryman was back in California, now realizing that movie studios would pay him far more than he could make anywhere else, including with his own paintings. He had imagined that his old boss, Cedric Gibbons, might hold a grudge against him, as he'd left MGM to pursue his own art, but he was surprised to see how easily Gibbons welcomed him back to MGM. By April, he was back at work in the Newcomb Building, creating sketches for a period drama, Marie Antoinette, which, just like A Tale of Two Cities, was a lavish historical production set in France during the Revolution. His work on Marie Antoinette put him back in contact with many artists he had known for years, including Gibbons. After Marie Antoinette, he worked on other MGM productions, including an adaptation of The Lost World, never released, and The Wizard of Oz. For this film, his focus was largely on creating the Emerald City, a set of stages that would be presented in full color. This, for Ryman, was new. Nearly all of the MGM features on which he had worked had been presented fully in black and white. Though with the success of Disney's full-color fantasy Snow White, other studios were exploring how color films might attract a larger audience. In this, for the first time, Ryman was invited to use his understanding of color, concepts he had developed for his personal art, in designs for a film. But Oz was an outlier at MGM. Despite the lavish production values arranged for this film, Ryman saw how the studio had changed during the 2 years he'd been away. Gibbons was still there, but the studio had lost both Irving Thalberg, who had died of pneumonia, and David O. Selznick, who had started his own production company, which created a power vacuum at MGM. Irving Thalberg had died, Ryman said. He was kind of a genius for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and things were no longer the same. Without these producers, Ryman believed that the studio was making poor choices in terms of how to fill out and manage openings in various units. Instead of hiring the best people, the studio was filling positions with modestly experienced nephews and nieces of executives, along with other distant relatives. Ryman believed that, and this nepotism was just terrible. as it brought in outsiders who neither understood film production nor respected art. At first, he tried to adapt to the new system, working around bureaucratic roadblocks to improve the art he created for a film. Among his new tricks was to bribe the research gals in the research library there to get all the best research, which in turn allowed him to create stronger designs. But such tricks could only improve his situation a little. Ultimately, he came to resent some newly hired managers overseeing the art department. These nephews of the managers, Ryman explained, would come in and they'd tear up your drawings physically. The best years of MGM, he believed, were fading away, with the studio becoming more businesslike in its approach to filmmaking. Ryman fluctuated between a desire to stay and a desire to quit. I had very definitely resolved that I was going to leave MGM, he said. But he also realized it would be difficult to leave, as he had spent his savings in Europe, Asia, and New York. To add to these troubles, on August 8th, his sister Lucille was in an automobile accident, leaving her with a concussion. Though she was expected to fully recover, she would need to take months off from work. Universal Pictures allowed her a medical leave of absence, but the medical expenses and day-to-day support may have fallen partially on Herbie, as a week or two after her accident, he looked for a second job, asking friends at MGM about possible openings. He eventually learned of a part-time teaching position at the Chouinard Art Institute, a school in downtown Los Angeles that in recent years had focused some of its classes on film production. By 1938, Chouinard offered courses in art-related aspects of live-action film production, specifically courses in set design, set drafting, set decoration, and costume design, with the division overseen by Harold Miles, who had worked with Ryman on Romeo and Juliet. Under Miles' direction, Herbie was given a teaching position where in the evenings he taught set design to a small group of interested students. For Herbie, the culture of Chouinard was an interesting crossroads, a mingling of two different studios gathered to form a unique school. Along with Miles, Ryman was joined by two other artists who had been connected to MGM for years: William Ferrari, an architect who taught set drafting, and Henry Grace, a designer who taught set decoration. The other half of Chouinard's motion picture department was filled with artists who worked during the day at the Disney studio, such as story artist Joe Grant, background painter Gene Fleury, and Disney in-studio animation instructor Palmer Shop. Around the campus, MGM artists discussed how the atmosphere at their studio was changing for the worse, shifting away from Thalberg's grand idea of art, and the Disney artists discussed how their studio was improving, with Walt attempting to make animation into a type of moving illustration, something far more sophisticated than the comic-centered short cartoons that had defined the medium at the start of the 1930s. In this way, Ryman learned that the Disney studio had evolved so that its structure now mimicked that of a major studio. Walt, of course, was the producer like Irving Thalberg. Beneath him were two teams that worked in tandem, groups that contained the highest paid artists at the studio. One team developed pictorial scripts by laying out stories with quick sketches that were push-pinned to a corkboard. As a story developed, the images could be moved, expanded, or taken down to change the tempo and focus of each scene. This group functioned similar to screenwriters at MGM, only their emphasis was more on visual storytelling than on a story related through text. The other high-paid lead team was comprised of concept artists such as Gustav Tengren, whose early illustrations and paintings shaped the visual tone of a film, similar to Cedric Gibbons' role at MGM. Beneath these two groups were artists in other roles. Layout artists took the material from the story department, along with visual cues from concept artists, to create a series of drawings that planned out each scene, how the background would be arranged, where animated characters would stand or walk, and how props would be configured. These drawings were, in ways, similar to the work that Ryman was doing at MGM. These layout drawings, once complete, would guide painters in creating backgrounds which, in an animated film, functioned as the sets. The layout drawings also guided lead animators in mapping out animation for each scene, where to position a character and how it should move, so that the action paired perfectly with the background. These lead animators, in ways, used the tools of acting to create gesture and movement that clearly expressed the character's emotions. Beyond this, the work was then fanned out to scores of other artists and technicians, from effects animators to inkers and painters, from camera operators to editors, to finish the film. In this way, Walt had developed the process of animation from a small group of artists sitting in a common room to create 6-minute comedies, to create a sophisticated production unit in which artists specialized in key aspects of production, similar to the production process at live-action studios. As the school year began, Chouinard's business manager, Vern Caldwell, asked Herbie if he would be interested in displaying his watercolors and drawings in one of the Chouinard downtown buildings, both as a way to present it to the public and also as a means to introduce his work to his students. Just down the way from the school, on Grandview Street, Chouinard also owned a gallery. Ryman said that he would be happy to show his work. Though some pieces had sold in New York, he still had more than enough drawings and paintings to create a one-person show focused on his travels. In September 1938, the Chouinard Gallery presented Ryman's personal work to Los Angeles, a show filled largely with landscapes and figure drawings of people he had observed while in Japan and China, as well as a few watercolors he had created 1 year earlier in Maine. The show also featured a few set and continuity sketches he had created for MGM, which served as examples of his studio work for those in his class. The show was a mix of personal and commercial art. A gifted artist who possessed two modes of expression, one used to develop his own vision of the world, and another to create motion pictures viewed by millions. A small crowd of enthusiasts came to see his work, including reporters for local papers. About his work in Asia, one reviewer noted, "Ryman's pen drawings of people, places, and architectural or other details in Peking or Angkor Wat are thrilling adventures in quite free but purposeful line, so pure that the paper it graces seems to sparkle." For 2 weeks, the show was enjoyed by artists and art critics. Those animation instructors at Chouinard were particularly impressed with Ryman's presentation of the human form in action, a skill that they were forever trying to teach their students. In all likelihood, those Disney artists such as Palmer Shop were surprised to see that Ryman, an artist whose professional work was focused on set design, was also deeply gifted with human form. They may have also been intrigued by Ryman's watercolors of rural Maine, as the studio was then developing an animated feature, Bambi, which would be set in such an environment. As the exhibit was moving into its final days, Vern Caldwell again sought out Ryman with a request. It was as though Caldwell could see with clarity how Ryman's career might expand in the years ahead. He explained that the Disney studio was expanding to create more features such as Snow White. They were working on a film that explored how classical music might be presented with moving art. They were also working on Pinocchio and Bambi, both of which would have highly realistic characters far more sophisticated than those in early cartoons. "I'm not a cartoonist," Herbie said, "and I'm not an animator. I have a great admiration for everything that Walt Disney has done, but I wouldn't be of any use to him whatsoever." Walt is intending to devote his future to full-length animated feature films, Caldwell explained, and he realizes he's got to have something other than just cartoonists. He's got to have some very fine artists, people like yourself. "That's a great compliment," Ryman said, "but I really don't know that I could fit in at all." Caldwell believed that Herbie was wrong, so changing tactics, he asked, Would you permit Walt Disney to exhibit your work out at the Hyperion studio? Oh yeah, he said, sure, I don't care. They have an annex out there, Caldwell explained, and I'm sure that it would be very inspiring for these young people to see what you've done. Oh, of course, Ryman said. Days later, Ryman received a letter addressed to him at MGM from Walt Disney Productions, officially inviting him to show his work. Dear Mr. Ryman, it began, several of the fellows here at the Walt Disney Studio have viewed your excellent exhibition at the Chenard Art Gallery. We would very much like to have your permission to show this exhibition here at the studio for several weeks. Ryman's show at the Chenard Gallery ended on Saturday, October 8th, which allowed the exhibit to be transferred to the Disney Studio the following Monday, where it was set up as an in-studio exhibit. The Disney Studio at this time was located on Hyperion Avenue, a few miles outside of Hollywood. In its early years, the complex had been created around a two-story building and soundstage, though during the period leading up to Snow White, the company had outgrown its buildings and had expanded as best it could, adding new structures on open land. They also bought or rented local houses, which they converted into workspace for artists. The mention of this annex likely meant little to Herbie, other than it was a building that was detached from the main complex. But the annex at the Disney Studio had a special purpose. It was the building that the studio used to train new animators. In the annex, animation hopefuls, often coming from art programs across the country, learned how to adapt their existing skills for animation. They studied character movement, specifically how to space their drawings, so that when viewed in quick succession, they produced fluid and believable movement. They studied how hair moved, how hands moved, how lips were arranged to create words, and how clothes shifted over a body when in motion. They studied character design. In Snow White, released the previous year, the studio had successfully created a believable young girl in animated scenes, but animators struggled to create realistic human characters beyond her. The dwarves, more than anything, were cartoon characters. The evil queen was far more menacing when she transformed into the hag, again a cartoon character. Most problematic was the prince, who appeared without strong definition and whose movements, even after revision, lacked fluidity. To improve animation in forthcoming features, Disney animators and trainees all studied the human form in life drawing sessions, action analysis classes, and by reviewing the work of finished scenes. Almost surely, Ryman's drawings were offered as an example as to how the human form could be expressed with depth and believability as a set of lines. Simply put, Ryman's work presented skills that were outside of those possessed by most animators, particularly the new ones. Again, it's possible that Ryman's watercolors, focused on coastal regions of Maine, including sections of forests, may have also interested Disney, serving as visual inspirations for the setting of Bambi. Beyond this, there was one more context for the presentation of Ryman's work. Unlike at MGM, where visual displays were arranged almost wholly to create commercial art for films, at Disney, art at times existed to be explored and considered on its own, beyond thought of how it might be used in film production, more so than any other studio. Disney existed as an arts collective that ultimately produced animation, but was openly interested in art for its own sake as well. For many, this environment was something akin to an art school, arranged inside of a commercial animation studio, which kept artists at the studio year after year, even though they might make more money elsewhere. Many at the studio were deeply impressed with Herbie's work. Among them was Ryman's old friend Ken Anderson, who had once worked alongside him at MGM, before being laid off and finding a position at Disney. I knew that Herbie wasn't happy, as he hated the nepotism at the MGM studio. Anderson said. He talked with Herbie about working for Disney, though Ryman was conflicted, as he knew he'd make less money at an animation studio, but also he was tired of the problems at MGM. Hopeful that he could move this situation forward, Anderson talked to Walt. "I sure met a great artist over at MGM," he said, "and I think that he'd be wonderful working here. I don't know what he'd do, but I suppose he could work in story." As Anderson recalled, Walt was very sympathetic right off the bat. This conversation initiated the offer of an interview, which was communicated through Vern Caldwell, the business manager at Chouinard. Over at the Chouinard campus, Caldwell took Herbie aside and explained that many at the Disney studio had been impressed with his work. "They would like to have an interview with you. Would you consent to have an interview?" "Of course," Ryman said. But then he added, "Nothing will come of it, but I'd like to see everyone. I'd like to meet them. If they like my work and if they think there's a place for me, there's no harm in trying it." He arrived at the Disney studio to find a 2-story Spanish structure surrounded by smaller buildings and sections of grass. Above it all was a neon sign featuring Mickey Mouse with his hand raised in welcome. If Caldwell was correct, the Mickey Mouse sign was more of a tribute to the studio's past as opposed to a vision of its future. Once inside, Ryman expected to meet Walt himself, but instead he met with other artists. He talked with Hugh Hennessy, who had been an art director on Snow White and was now working on the concert feature that Caldwell had mentioned. He also met Charlie Filippi, another art director who had worked on Snow White and was now at work on Pinocchio. From this, Ryman knew that the studio was considering him for a role in art direction, which was a significant step up from his current position at MGM. Ryman also knew that there were other concept artists above Hennessy and Filippi, such as Gustav Tengren, who designed the visual presentation of an entire picture. "They thought that maybe I could do something like Tengren," Ryman said, and this possibility intrigued him. He was being offered a role that, if it worked out, might be similar to that of Cedric Gibbons at MGM, though Disney's, of course, was a far smaller studio. While there, Ryman met with others, including his old friend Ken Anderson. Together, the Disney artist explained that their studio was creating features to compete with those produced by MGM, Warner Brothers, and Fox. They also explained that though presently the studio was a hodgepodge of buildings that the company had outgrown, the Disney brothers had already bought 51 acres in Burbank, just down the road from Warner Brothers, where they would build a new studio complex with a series of buildings designed specifically for the production of animated features and shorts. In this, Ryman could see two things. The overall structure of the Disney operation would soon mimic that of a well-funded live-action studio, and the location of the new studio signaled that Disney was, in fact, trying to merge with mainstream Hollywood film production. Beyond this, Ryman knew that the Disney studio was deeply invested in full-color presentations. Everything at the studio, from shorts to features, was now arranged for the 3-strip Technicolor process, whereas most live-action studios, including MGM, still filmed most features in black and white. The effect was that a typical scene in a Disney film looked far more painterly than a typical scene produced by other studios. The one downside, of course, was pay. If Ryman took this job, he would make far less at Disney's than he did at MGM. But the idea of being an artist like Gustav Tengren intrigued him, a person who defined the vision of a film rather than a person who completed another artist's plans. Ryman would also be able to leave behind the infighting and incompetence that partially occupied the MGM art department. Beyond this, his sister was recovering from her car accident and would soon return to Universal, meaning that he could live on a lower salary. But it was these two things, a vision of himself with more artistic authority and a more congenial workplace focused on art, that led him ultimately to accept the offer. I took a 50% cut in my salary, he said, to go to work there because I thought it was a challenge. And he hoped that this change would elevate him into a new phase of his career. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 100 episodes not available anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here. You can become a monthly Bandcamp subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.